Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of HBI podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Dennis MacDonald, and today we're going to be discussing Luke and Homer. So welcome back to the show, Dennis.
Oh, thank you, Jacob. It's a pleasure always.
Yeah, so we're going to be going into additional parallels between Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the Homeric epics. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the PDF slides, and we'll get started.
Okay, let's not go to that slide quite yet.
Okay.
I want to kind of make that the Trump hand,
Sure.
and I want to set up the issue. Now, some of your viewers may have seen the interview we did not long ago about the Acts of the Apostles and Luke's use of classical Greek poetry. And there, the parallels are overwhelming. And many of them had been seen by scholars before I became interested in mimesis criticism. So I want to begin with Acts only to say that to understand Luke's literary accomplishment, one needs to consider not only the gospel, but also his second volume, where he no longer is using as many sources as he had available to him in writing the Gospels, and therefore had more freedom to use literary models. And the four kinds of models he used were the Iliad, the Odyssey, Euripides' Bacchae, and Plato's depiction of Socrates, especially in the Phaedo. That is the account of the death of Socrates, his last days, and his discourses on the soul. Now, we need to then walk back into the Gospel of Luke and understand what sources he had available to him. And he admits that he has these sources in his first four verses. Many have undertaken to write expositions, diegesis, of the things that have happened among us. But it seemed good to me, after investigating them all, to put them in the correct order for you, Theophilus, so that you may know the truth of the logoi, or the sayings, that you'd been instructed in. Now, those sources have been contested. We know that one of the sources was the Gospel of Mark. I'm convinced that Luke also knew Matthew, but even if he knew Matthew, he must have known another source, now lost. It's similar to traditional Q documents, but my Q is substantially longer and is developed out of different criteria. And Jacob, I have another book coming out, really, I hope in the next few months, called Homer and the Quests for Q and Jesus. And this is the book that I really wanted to write instead of the Synopses of Epic, Tragedy, and the Gospels, because that's a resource, it's a reference work that I can appeal to now to make my case for solving the so-called synoptic problem. Now, let's then say that we'll just stay with Luke and Mark at this point, because that's the one connection that is most universally accepted. Mark already has been imitating Homer, and especially the passages at the end of the gospel where the death of Jesus is similar to the death of Hector. Now, Luke knows that story and he adjusts it, but he adjusts it to make Jesus much more like Socrates in the Phaedo, because Jesus is afraid of death, but he submits to it. He says that his God has abandoned him. Luke isn't going to take that business. So Luke's Jesus is dispassionate when he comes to Gethsemane. And he kneels and commits himself to the will of his Father. He is not talking at the cross. He does not say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He says victoriously, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." He forgives the executioners who are crucifying him, much as Socrates forgives the person who issues him the hemlock for his death. Only in Luke is Jesus surrounded by his friends as he dies, which is similar to what one finds in Plato. So a number of scholars have beautifully articulated these parallels between the death of Socrates and the Luke and Jesus. So I don't need to say any more about it. But this is fascinating to me, Jacob. Luke knew that Mark had imitated the Iliad for the death of Hector. And there are two ways that we know that. One is that he adds to the Markan account Jesus's panicking over the destruction of Jerusalem. And then he has a passage for the daughters of Jerusalem, which is similar to what one finds in Homer's treatment of the women of Troy, the so-called weeping Trojan women. And I'm assuming that you have a copy of my synopses in front of you. And I want to encourage you to turn to page 260.
I'm there.
Okay. I'm going to begin, and I'm going to have you read the passage from the Iliad. Just the Iliad. And then I'll read the passage from Luke 19. I'm reading from a corrected version of the book, which already is out. Because I don't want to repeat the error on this podcast. So if you see where the image is at the top of the page?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to the right of that, there's a paragraph that begins in the following passage. I'll read that little passage. In the following passage, Priam, an old man and near death, predicts the fall of Troy and fears the murder of Trojan babies, including his grandson, Astyniax. Luke's Jesus, on his way to Jerusalem and his death, similarly laments its impending siege and the dashing of children to the ground. So go ahead and read.
Did you move that was that paragraph moved in the corrected version? Oh wait, you're talking about page 260. I was looking at the wrong page.
So the quotation begins, Priam to Hector.
Yeah. Priam to Hector, while I'm still alive. Have pity on me, unhappy and unlucky, whom the father, the son of Kronos, will destroy at the threshold of old age with a harsh lot after seeing many woes. My sons perishing, my daughters dragged off, my treasures pillaged, little children dashed to the ground in dread combat, my daughters-in-law, such as Andromache, hauled off by the Achaeans.
Continue.
Thus spoke the old man, and his gray hairs with his hands he uprooted. Not even then did he sway Hector's mind.
Vergil imitated these lines for Turnus's Latinus's plea to Turnus not to fight Aeneas in the Iliad. We don't need to worry about here. But here's Luke's equivalent. It occurs just after Jesus's triumphal entry. As he approached, he saw the city and wept for it, saying, "If only you too knew the things that lead to peace. For now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come when your enemies, like Hector's enemies, the Achaeans, will erect palisades against you, encircle you, oppress you from every side." That is, there'll be a siege. and dash to the ground you and your children with you, and not leave in you a stone upon stone, because you did not know the time of your visitation. That is very close to the appeal of Priam, who talks about my son's perishing, my daughter's dragged off, children dashed to the ground in dread combat after the siege. But there's another one, Jacob, that I find even more interesting. And this you're going to find on page 289.
I'm there.
Let's do this the same way. You read well Homer. This is the weeping women of Jerusalem, which is modeled after the weeping Trojan women in the Iliad. The introduction to number 186, that's what we just read, Jacob, compared Jesus's weeping for Jerusalem in Luke to Priam's fear about the fall of Troy in his plea that Hector not fight Achilles. Here in number 212, Luke imitates the plea of Hector's mother, Hecuba, that immediately followed Priam's in Iliad 22. The epic and the gospel both use the metaphor of green wood for the estimable man about to die in his youth. So if you read this.
Hector was on his way to fight
No. His mother, for her part. Do you see where that is?
Yes. His mother, for her part, mourned and shed tears. Unclasping her garment, with one hand she held out a breast, with the other, as she shed tears, she spoke winged words. Hector, my child, have regard for these and take pity on me. If ever I gave you the breast, that banishes worry. Remember these, dear child, and ward off the enemy from inside the wall. Do not stand there as a champion against him, that rogue, for if he kills you, I will never weep for you upon a bier, dear young green shoot, whom I bore.
So Vergil uses this appeal for Queen Amata having a plea to Turnus not to fight Aeneas. Now let's skip those lines and let's look at the boxes that follow. So you see where I have compare the following?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, so I'll read the left-hand column, Jacob, and then you can read the right.
Yes.
Hector was on his way to fight Achilles.
Jesus was on the way to the cross.
Priam and the Trojan women saw Hector outside the gates. The old man beat his head with his hands and cried out in anguish.
A large crowd of the people followed him, including women who were beating themselves and waiting for him.
And the Greek words are related to each other, by the way. His mother, for her part, mourned and shed tears, unclasping the fold of her garment with one hand, held out her breast, and so on. We've already read that. So go ahead and read the equivalent, Jacob.
Jesus turned to them and said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep rather for yourselves and for your children. For behold, days are coming in which people will say, Blessed are the sterile, and the wombs that never gave birth, and the breasts that never gave suck.
They will say to the mountains, this is from Hosea, hide us, and to the hills fall on us.
Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, hide us.
For if he kills you, I will never weep for you on a bier, dear young green shoot.
For if they do these things to wood that is green, what will happen to the dry?
In his speech, Hector to Hector, Priam had predicted the fall of Troy and feared for its women and children.
Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem and feared for its women and their children.
I think it's astonishing that you have these parallels, the appeal to the breasts, right? Then also the image of, at the end, So in Luke, if they do these things to wood that is green, that is to Jesus in his youth and innocence, what will they do to the dry, that is to the revolutionary Jews who are going to oppose the Romans? But in the same address from Hecuba, you have the business about, I will never weep for you, my dear green shoot.
Yeah.
That is, he's dying in his youth. So several things I think are noteworthy. And then I want you to get your reactions, Jacob, so you can be thinking of them. One is that the parallels are quite striking. Another is that Luke is showing sensitivity to the women of Jerusalem the same way that Hecuba is appealing to concern for herself and other weeping Trojan women. And this is in anticipation of the death of Jesus. Although when Luke writes about the death of Jesus, he's going to compare Jesus more to Socrates than to Hector. In large measure because the death of Hector was a loss and a tragedy, whereas the death of Socrates is much more of a victory because he's overcoming death with his own courage. So the only reason I'm presenting this is that Luke already knows that his scene in Mark, Homeric imitation, and he wants not to miss out on the wagon or miss the train. And so he has it for himself before the death. And then we're going to see he has a magnificent imitation of the Odyssey after Jesus' death as a part of his resurrection appearances.
I think it's incredible because it really shows the amount of effort that the author is putting into systematically reusing the material and placing it and trying to place it in a Hellenistic Jewish context.
Isn't it amazing that other people haven't seen this before?
It is. It really is.
I mean, it just means that people haven't been paying attention to their Greek poetry, I guess.
Before we continue, we have a super chat question from Kathy Brocado. Thank you for your super chat. I enjoyed your course. Have you read Mark Bilby's The Gospel of the Poor's version of Q? If so, how does it compare to your version of Q? Thank you.
Actually, Mark Bilby is a very good friend of mine. We were actually colleagues at the School of Theology. I differ greatly with Mark on for a number of reasons, but I haven't seen what he calls the gospel of the poor. So I do know that he was taken, at least for a while, with the business about Marcion's gospel, which we could talk about at some other time. And he thought that there was a way of ferreting out the lost gospel, which other people have identified it by Q, with Marcion's gospel. Mark is no longer committed to biblical scholarship as an occupation, but he is a very bright and industrious person. So I wouldn't want to diss my friend, especially on this podcast, without having read more carefully what he's presented. But I do know that my methodology is very different from his, and that the results would be very different as well. And the primary issue that I'd had with Mark's earlier work was that he thinks that one can take the Gospel of Luke and see in it, especially in the Marcion Gospel, evidence of the Or Gospel, the earliest one, and then say that can explain the synoptic problem. Well, I have enormous problems with that. Not least because the Gospel of Luke surely is the last of the Gospels, and it's there where you find these extended Homeric imitations. And by the way, Marcion's Gospel was already detached from the Acts of the Apostles, where we find an explosion of the parallels of Greek poetry. So, Kathy, good for you. You're smart. You're reading. Mark is a friend of mine. Say hi. But I don't know that I can say more about it without having read it carefully.
Based on what you just said and what we've covered in the past and so far in this show, Luke, would it be fair to say that Luke uses Homer on a greater scale than Mark does?
If one adds the Acts of the Apostles, the answer is yes. But let's stay with the gospel. The question that I have is, how much of Mark's imitation of Homer did Luke recognize? We've already seen that he recognized some of it with the death of Hector, but are there other places where I'm not sure he recognized those parallels, or he was just happy of repeating what he had read in Mark? A good example is the Gerasene demoniac story, where Luke's version purges so much of the details that identify the Gerasene demoniac with Polyphemus that it almost is as if he's scrubbing the narrative to get the Homeric elements out. So I don't know how to factor that in, but I can say, and I can give you some other examples of it, that he recognizes that Mark already had imitated the Homeric epics, and he has his own. So you could say that Luke has more of them if he were aware of what Mark already had done before him, because Luke has about 3/4 of the episodes that Mark used from Homer, and he repeats it. So if we count those, I suppose one could say that Luke has more than Mark does. But I'm leery of doing that because I'm not so sure in many cases that he's aware of what Mark had done.
You ready to go ahead and start taking a look at the PDF slides?
Sure, let's do that. It depends on how long we want to go, Jacob. I'm free for the rest of the day, so that's not a problem. But I don't want to wear you or your viewers out.
Oh no, I've got plenty of time too.
I have one other example that I could give you, but maybe we could do it later, because the one that I propose that we talk about today is so rich and so complex that it probably could take the rest of the time that we have without boring our viewers. But if we needed one more, I've got one in my pocket.
You want to go ahead and take a look at that before we get to the slides?
No, let's go ahead and take the slides. That's fine.
All right.
This is from my synopses, and there's an excursus of Jesus's revelation to two disciples compared with Odysseus's revelation to Laertes. Now, I probably should set up the story for you. Odysseus has been gone for 20 years, and his family and his slaves are convinced that he has died either in the war or at sea. And Penelope has been pressured by the suitors to select one of them to marry. And Telemachus is told that his father's alive, but he is concerned about it. But almost everyone, including Laertes, his father, is convinced he's died. And Laertes, in grief, goes into the fields where he has planted his orchards, and is tending to his orchards, living in a hut with his own slaves, but mourning the loss of his son. Odysseus comes back. He slays the suitors. He punishes the unfaithful slaves. And then he decides that he will go to his father. And so I'll do some of this reading. Jacob, just stop me if anything I say is not clear. But it goes like this. He says to himself, I will test my father, whether he will recognize and perceive me with his eyes or not recognize me because I was gone for so long. He found his father alone in his well-tended orchard. I lost the slide. Jacob, are you there? Hello?
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. A little bit of a disconnection there. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
All right, let me just pull this back up. All right, continue, please.
He found his father alone in his well-tended orchard. Old man, whose slave are you? Whose orchard do you tend? He went on to say that he was hoping to find the island of Ithaca and receive hospitality from an old acquaintance named Odysseus. His father responded to him, shedding tears. Stranger, you have indeed arrived at the land about which you asked, but insolent and wicked men now have it. Can you scroll down a bit? If you had found him alive in the land of Ithaca, he then would have reciprocated well with gifts and sent you off with a good guest gift. At this, the old man broke into sobs, and the hero no longer had stomach to prolong the agony. He kissed Laertes and said, Father, I here am that man whom you seek. I have come to my homeland in the 20th year. But Dad had doubts. If you are indeed my son Odysseus who has come home, tell me now some recognizable sign so that I may be persuaded. In response, crafty Odysseus told him, First consider with your eyes this scar that when I went to Parnassus, a boar gouged with a white tusk. So he spoke, and the knees and dear heart of Laertes gave way when he recognized the sure signs that Odysseus showed him. Then he threw both arms around his dear son. Can you scroll down? Odysseus made this proposal. Let's go to your home. That sits beside the orchard. Earlier, I sent Telemachus, the cattleman and the swineherd there so that they might quickly prepare a dinner. Thus conversed the two of them and went off to the good house. Jacob, how about if you read the next paragraph? Luke already had.
Sure. Luke had already imitated this famous reunion of Odysseus and Laertes in his parable of the prodigal son. But the parallels with the end of the gospel are even more extensive and should be incontrovertible. In hashtag 226, God had blinkered the eyes of two grieving disciples so that they would not recognize Jesus, who joins them on a walk to the village Emmaus. They tell him about their Lord's death, whom they had hoped would liberate Israel. Jesus, still undetected, instructs them that the Messiah first must suffer, goes with them into a village for a meal and breaks bread with them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. In the final book of the Odyssey, Laertes at the first could not recognize his son with his eyes, but later he recognized the sure signs that Odysseus showed him, including his childhood scar. Later, at a second meal, Jesus will reveal his identity to the 11, by displaying his wounds. They then will recognize him and rejoice.
Okay, can you scroll down a little bit and get those text boxes?
Yes.
Okay, so here we're going to read these stories. I'll read the left column. I will test my father whether he will recognize me and perceive me with his eyes or not recognize me.
Their eyes were kept from recognizing him.
In both works, recognition scenes later involved meals. Odysseus to Laertes, let's go to your home that sits beside the orchard. Earlier, I sent Telemachus the cattleman and the swineherd there so that they might quickly prepare a dinner.
They prevailed on him and said, "Stay with us, for it is almost evening, and the day already is far spent."
So spoke the two of them and went off to the good house.
He went in to stay with them.
Okay, let's scroll down a little bit. I don't want to read this wonderful story because I want to get to the next section. There we go. When Odysseus and Laertes arrived at the well-situated house, they found Telemachus, the cattleman, the swineherd, carving large quantities of meat. From the fields ready for dinner came the slaves. When they saw Odysseus had recognized him in their hearts, they just stood there in the halls, astonished. Then Odysseus chided them with gentle words. Old man, sit down to dinner, and you servants rid your minds of wonder. When he had so spoken, Dolius spread both hands, made straight for him, took Odysseus' hand and kissed his wrist. So read the next paragraph, huh? Similarly,
At the end of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus appears to the 11 at a meal and exposes his wounds, evoking Odysseus' telltale sign. Consider with your eyes this scar.
Okay, can you? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Let's get to the boxes.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're just going to run through this, and I think it'll be quite astonishing. The two, Odysseus and Laertes, went off to the good house, and when they arrived at the well-situated house, they found Evron, Telemachus, the cattleman, and the swineherd carving large quantities of meat.
They rose up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and those with them gathered together.
Again, the Greek word Evron. What follows resembles Odysseus' reception among Laertes' slaves. When they saw Odysseus and recognized him in their hearts, they just stood there in their halls astonished.
As they were saying these things, Jesus himself stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace to you." They were startled and terrified. They thought they were seeing a spirit.
Then Odysseus chided them with gentle words. Old man, sit down in dinner, and you servants rid your minds of wonder.
And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do misgivings arise in your hearts?
First consider with your eyes this scar that when I went to Parnassus a boar gouged. I hear him that man.
See my hands and my feet, that is, I myself. Handle me and look. A spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." Having said this, he showed them his hands and his feet.
And Jacob, you and your viewers, even if you don't know Greek, should be able to see the similarities in the Greek between those expressions, myself, and so on. Okay, let's scroll down. Continue, please. Scroll down a little more. I'm not sure I saw what I'm looking for. Yeah, let's scroll down. Okay, there we go. This is the summary of these final passages. Oh no, this is a different. Well, I can show you this one. When Odysseus goes to the netherworld, he sees his mother and he tries to hug her, but his hands go right through her because ghosts do not have bodily or corporal identity. So we'll compare these. When Odysseus saw the soul, the psyche of his mother, he tried to hug her, but she flitted away.
They were startled and terrified. They thought they were seeing a spirit.
So she then explained to him why the dead cannot be touched. This is the situation with mortals whenever someone dies.
And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do misgivings arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself."
For the tendons no longer can hold together the flesh and bones.
Touch me and look, a mere spirit does not have flesh and bone, as you see that I have.
On the one hand, the mighty force of burning fire destroys when the spirit first leaves the white bones. On the other hand, the soul takes wing and flies away like a dream.
Having said this, he showed them his hands and his feet.
Okay, I am going to read a little Greek in the third box.
Sure.
Ugar eti sarkastike astia inises equisen. And that expression appears almost verbatim. Pneuma sarka ke astia uk echi kathose me theotheti ekonta. So a spirit does not have flesh and bone that you see that I have. Now, the difference is that in the Homeric world, a soul does not have corporeality. But in Luke, because Jesus is going to ascend, he does. A spirit does not have flesh and bone that you see that I have. That is, they're not seeing a spirit, they're seeing his resurrected body. So that's a good example of syncrisis, of a comparison that Jesus' resurrected body is corporeal, whereas Anticlea's is not. So again, I don't know why people haven't seen these parallels. I just don't get it. And of course, scholars and many Christian believers would not accept it.
Why do you think the scholars don't accept it?
I think the reasons are complex, and I don't want to second guess them. But the Academy has not been schooled in looking at archaic Greek poetry for the resources of the Gospels. And there are lots of reasons for it. That is, the Homeric epics were not written, they were written almost 7 centuries earlier than the Gospels. They're written in archaic Greek, which most people, Greek speakers in the Roman Empire, probably couldn't read. These are stories of war. The Gospels are not a story of a war, except it anticipates the Jewish war. It's a story that it has polytheism, and the gods are are rather reprehensible in some cases. And so that's one reason. Another is that we have, as scholars, been so concerned, and legitimately so, with the parallels to Jewish scriptures, that we've thought that once we can identify the Jewish scriptural backgrounds and the contemporary Greek impulses, let's say novels and biographies, that our job is done. But there's so much more that is important. And by the way, Homer was more important in the early Roman Empire than any Greek prose that was written at that time. So if we're staying only with the likes of Josephus or Lucian or Plutarch and so on, we're missing the wonderful poetry that inspired the Greeks to establish their identity in the Roman Empire. And it's a real tragedy. And Jews were doing it as well as Christians.
Does Luke seem to use Homer more in his gospel, or does he exhibit a greater use of Homer in the book of Acts?
Definitely. Independent imitations of Homer are much more prevalent in the Acts of the Apostles. But remember, and you're not challenging this, Luke acts as a continuous and intentional single literary work. So what one says about the Gospels needs to be peppered with information that we can get from the Acts of the Apostles.
Did you get into that example that you were talking about earlier before we took a look at the slides?
You want to see one more example? Is that what you're saying?
You mentioned an example that you wanted.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Show.
In this case, we need to turn to page 100.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay, you beat me. At this point, I think what we can do is I'll give a summary of page 100, and then you see the text boxes on page 101.
Yes.
Okay, and so we'll read those text boxes after I give an introduction.
Sure.
But before I do that, I'm going to ask you a favor.
Sure.
I want you to give a plug for the book we're reading from, the Synopses of Epic, Tragedy, and the Gospels.
Yes.
Because the sales are sluggish right now, and they are not penetrating, as far as I can tell, the scholarly world. But it has so much more interest in the people like most of your viewers who are interested in these topics. And are, amateur classicists or biblical scholars. But you're not going to find these parallels, and I think you'd agree with this, Jacob. You're not going to find these parallels anywhere else, except in my own books, the rest of which are really quite expensive. So you can get this book right now from Amazon for under $30. This is 570 pages of my life's work, and it's a breakthrough. Even if you don't buy all the parallels, this is, I would hope, rather stimulating to one's imagination about ancient religion.
I went ahead and I put the link in the super chat, and I put the link right there in the bottom.
Oh,
there.
good, great.
So they can just type that if they want to.
And I really do value reviews on Amazon. So if one has this book or will buy it and take a look at it, I do appreciate the support. But Jacob, I want you to affirm this. Are you going to find this kind of thing elsewhere?
Oh,
no,
I don't. I don't think so.
Yeah. So even if you want to oppose it, this is the book you need to oppose. So go ahead and get a copy. Okay, so let's take a look at page 101, and I'll set the context for it. Already in the Gospel of Luke and in Mark, and in my view, also already in the Q document, you have Jesus's rejection at home. And a prophet is not welcome except is welcome except in his own country, his own homeland. So you have that already in the tradition, and Luke gets a hold of it, and he greatly expands it. But already in Mark, or in my view, Q, you have an imitation of the following story from the Odyssey, Book 2. Athena has empowered Telemachus by saying that he actually is now the grown son of his father, and he needs to do something about protecting his mother and their estate from the over 100 suitors that are vying for her hand and for the wealth. And in order to do so, Telemachus pulls together a council of Ithacans, all men, and asks them to help him oust the suitors from his halls. Many of the suitors are probably the sons of the Ithacan families themselves. They refuse to do so, and the suitors are outraged and want actually to kill Telemachus for challenging their right to the hand of his mother. And afterwards, Telemachus gets a boat to go to Pylos to consult with Nestor, who's recently returned from the war, to find out any news he can about his father, Odysseus. So when Jesus is empowered by the Holy Spirit, by declaring that Jesus is the Son of God, and after the temptation, the three temptations that Jesus needs to face against the devil, he goes back to Galilee and he announces that the kingdom of God has arrived. And he goes, at least in the Lucan version, immediately to his home. And people are wondering, where does he get this wisdom and this power? But they're scandalized by him. And this is where you get the famous saying, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. And then what does Jesus do what does Telemachus do? He gets a boat to sail off to Pylos. What does Jesus do after the Ithaca event? He gets sailors he calls sailors to follow him. Those are not innocent. So let's take a look at page 101. This is a summary of Odyssey 2 and the council. And so here we go. Telemachus, empowered by his encounter with Athena, convened an assembly of neighbors to seek the liberation of his house from the suitors.
Jesus, empowered by his baptism and the descent of the Spirit on him, preached at a synagogue in Nazareth, where he announced imminent liberation.
Telemachus stood in the center of the assembly, and a herald put the staff in his hand.
Jesus rose up to read and was given a book.
All the people gazed at him when he arrived.
Jesus was glorified by all after he read the text. The eyes of all in the synagogue were gazing at him.
Telemachus boldly set forth his intentions of ousting the suitors and freeing his household.
Jesus boldly set forth his mission to proclaim release to the captives.
Halitherses the prophet reminded the suitors of his prophecy long ago that Odysseus would return and liberate his house. And now all these things are being fulfilled.
This writing, the prophecy of the prophet Isaiah promising liberation, is fulfilled in your ears today.
Telemachus tossed the staff to the ground.
Jesus handed the scroll to the assistant.
Everyone was impressed by his eloquence.
Everyone was impressed by his eloquence.
Telemachus did not get what he had requested and alienated the suitors.
Jesus told the assembly that no prophet is acceptable in his own homeland, and gave as examples the ministries of Elijah and Elisha to Gentiles. As a result, he alienated everyone.
The suitors laid in wait on a rocky island for Telemachus's return so that they could kill him away from the city.
Those in the synagogue took Jesus outside the city on the brow of a mountain to kill him.
Thanks to Athena, Telemachus escaped and sought to reclaim his father's kingdom.
Jesus passed safely through the crowd and continued to proclaim the good news of his Father's kingdom.
Again, those parallels, I think, are so striking that I'm astonished that people smarter than I didn't see it before.
And I want to take a look at the next page real quick in 102, in which you show that there's even parallels between the Odyssey and the Logoi, the Q document.
Oh, aren't you venturesome? Okay. Here we go. This is really quite controversial, and that's why I am laughing about it. The Logoi document, as I reconstruct it, that is my version of Q, based on different criteria, is primarily interested in portraying Jesus as a more compassionate prophet like Moses. And to do so, he's imitating Deuteronomy. And so he really is a very seriously left-leaning interpreter of Jewish law, which gets him in trouble with Pharisees and may in fact have caused the Romans to crucify him because of the turmoil. That's my reading of Josephus. Okay, so even in the Lost Gospel, we find some parallels to this business in Odyssey 1-2. As Odysseus' son Telemachus was the rightful heir of his father's estate, but the suitors were threatening that authority. When he returned from Sparta, he could not risk going into his house. Instead, he lived in the shack of a swineherd.
As the Son of God, Jesus was entitled to authority over the world, but he rejected this authority when the devil offered it. The Son of Man does not have anywhere he can lay his head.
Empowered by Athena's affirmation of his sonship and encouragement to assert his authority, Telemachus challenged and threatened the suitors.
Empowered by the private knowledge that he was God's son, Jesus returned to Galilee and bravely announced, "Repent, the kingdom of God has arrived."
Telemachus called an assembly of his neighbors and asked them to oust the suitors. Although they were stirred by his courage, they refused to help.
At Nazara, his hometown, his neighbors were amazed at his wisdom. Even so, they were offended by him.
Telemachus received no help from the neighbors, so he and Athena Mentor had to sail off to consult Nestor and Menelaus about Odysseus' fate.
Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own homeland." He then left for Capernaum by the sea.
Athena Mentor provided Telemachus a ship with a crew.
At Capernaum, Jesus acquired followers.
Now, Jacob, I appreciate you pointing to these parallels, but I want to give a word of caution. I don't think the author of the Q document wanted readers to see the parallels to the Odyssey. Rather, the parallels to the Odyssey were there as a way of writing a story about how the young Jesus had been empowered by God to liberate his people and to announce a new kingdom. So it's not saying Jesus is better than Odysseus. It's not even to say that he's like him. It's rather to say that here we have a story of empowerment. By the way, we have lots of stories of empowerment. We have them, of course, with the prophets in the Bible. So that Ezekiel has a vision of God and the heavens open up and there's an announcement. He's called the Son of Man several times, and he's now to go to his people and to preach repentance. But we also find the calling of Isaiah. We find the empowerment of Daniel, of the empowerment of Moses as a young man. But we also find it in the history of religions. We find it, for example, in the Gilgamesh epic, or we find it in the story of the Buddha. where the Buddha gets enlightenment as a young man and then takes voluntary poverty and is interested in caring for the poor and finding a philosophy that would deal with suffering. So that we find these, by the way, you have the same thing going in Spider-Man and Superman and so on, right? This is how heroes are. They're not heroes out of the womb. Something happens in their youth that empowers them, gives them special powers, and they go and kick butt. So this is a part of the wonderful tale telling that Joseph Campbell has identified as a part of this, and Lord Raglan and others have identified as a part of the heroic cycle. And you find it also elsewhere in Greek mythology as well.
So how would you recommend readers to read your reconstruction of Q and to understand
it? This is going to require another podcast to do justice to.
I agree.
But the usual way of reconstructing Q starts with the recognition that Matthew and Luke share content with each other they didn't get from Mark, and that the International Q Project committed itself to saying Luke did not know Matthew. So both of them had to have been using a lost gospel, and sometimes Matthew is more primitive and sometimes Luke is. This is called alternating or oscillating primitivity. Sometimes Matthew's earlier, sometimes Luke is. I'm convinced Luke knows Matthew, so that criterion becomes a problem. Because Matthew and Luke have a source that's different from Mark, they attempt to remove all Markan influence from the Synoptic Gospels as a way of trying to scratch down into the ruins and to find the Q document. That's exactly the wrong way to go. The most important parallels to the Q document are in Mark. The problem is we have not understood how to understand Mark's use of the Q document. Mark loves and hates the Q document, and he's rewriting it in order to correct what he perceives to be the problems. And to do so, he's heavily invested in the Homeric epics. Now, this seems like it's not an answer to your question, Jacob, but it really is. If people want to know about the Q document, unfortunately, and I mean that sincerely, unfortunately, the only place they can go is my work. And one of the books that where I talk about this extensively is now on sale for $120. Now, there are not many of your viewers who are going to go jumping and get that book. The other one is available for $66. Check it out on Amazon. Fortunately, you can get the synopses, and it's got my reconstruction of Q both in Greek and in English with commentary for $30. So that's the place to go if you want to see it. Now, there are other ways. If people contacted me, I could send them a PDF of my reconstruction of the text in translation. And so then they can read it for themselves. But the advantage of reading it from the synopsis is that you can see how the Q text gets reconstructed by assessing for yourself the parallels pericope by pericope. And you can see how transgressively Mark rewrites it. So, for example, in the Q document, as I reconstructed, Jesus makes the threat against the temple. He'll destroy this temple made with hands and build another not made with hands. Mark hates that statement. because he's writing after the war, and Jesus didn't destroy the temple. The Romans did, and Jesus was not around to restore it in 3 days. So what do you do with that one? So you foist that statement onto the lips of false witnesses and hecklers at his death. Another example is the Jesus forgiving the promiscuous woman who's about ready to be stoned. Well, there are 3 things that the tradition didn't like about it, and it's already a problem in Mark. 1, Jesus chooses not to obey the Mosaic commandment. The second is he's writing mysteriously in the ground. And the third and the biggest problem is the woman never repents. He forgives her even though she is an unrepentant woman who's accused of many sins. Presumably that means many sexual sins. So Mark doesn't like that story. Matthew doesn't like the story. Luke changes it into the story of a contrite woman. Papias knows the story, but we don't know much of what he said about it. And then it doesn't make textual a sense for us until you see the early Latin texts of the Gospel of John, but early in this case is late 3rd century. So I think the way to read the Logoi of Jesus is to read it for itself. The original title likely was the Logoi of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus. It sometimes now, in my translation, is known as Q plus because it's much longer. But I would say sit down with a cup of coffee or your favorite adult beverage and read the story from beginning to end. And ask yourself what the author is trying to accomplish. What do we know about Jesus? What do we know about his companions? What do we know about his opponents? What do we know about John the Baptist? What do we know about his fate? What are we told about the kingdom of God? What is the way to handle justice and liberation? So just sit and enjoy it. Read it as you would another gospel, or the text of a prophet in the Hebrew Bible. Just sit and enjoy it. Let it wash over you, and then ask yourself, is there something here that I want to investigate more carefully? And then you could use my synopsis, or you could use commentaries to kind of ferret that out for yourselves. I'm not interested in proving my work to anybody. I'm interested in stimulating people's curiosity with good scholarship that makes a reliable, if not perfect, translation of a lost gospel. By the way, here's the other thing that I think is so important, Jacob, and I would hope some of your readers understand this. The earliest people to admire Jesus were not Christians. Arguments can be made that Paul is not a Christian, that he was still living out of Judaism, and he was formative for a later Christian identity. But I don't want to get into that. But the Q document is written by a Jew, and Jesus sends the disciples out not to go to Gentile dogs, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And Jesus is pronouncing the kingdom of God, which is the kingdom of the Jewish God, but it's a kingdom that no longer is run by strict Torah observance, but now by compassion and inclusion and a different set of values. So I think when people get done reading that document, they're going to be shocked that this Jesus is not the Christ of the Gospels. This Jesus is much more like Martin Luther King Jr.
And I think right there is a perfect way of ending this podcast. Next time you come on, or at some point later, we need to talk about your criteria of reconstructing Q.
Yeah.
I would also like to have slides side by side showing parallel passages and differences between the reconstructed Q and your version of Q.
Yeah, that's easy to do. I've got it. I'll just have to send it to you.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for joining me today, Dennis.
Well, thank you, Jacob, for entertaining me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.